speaking of double standards, let's turn to the topic of the day. President Biden has now worked with my former colleague, Lawrence Tribe, to try to weaken the Supreme Court. Now, if the shoe were on the other foot, if the Supreme Court were controlled by Democrats, if most of the appointments were made by Democrats, as the Warren Court was when I was a law clerk and when Tribe was a law clerk, Tribe would be on the other side. He would be saying, oh, you can't do things like that. You can't have term limits on the Supreme Court. That's unconstitutional. And all Biden and Tribe want to do is use this as a campaign issue against their political opponents. Nothing can be done. You can't create term limits. I'm actually in favor of term limits. If I were rewriting the Constitution, I would probably say judges and justices should serve 15 years, 18 years, 20 years. 10 is too short, 25 is too long. Somewhere in between. I would support that. I think that makes sense. But the Constitution has a specific provision in it. It says that justices shall serve during good behavior. Those are the words of the Constitution, which means until they resign, retire, or until they die. And that's been what's happened since 1793. But Lawrence Tribe and his student, Biden, think you can change all that legislatively. No, you can't. You have to do it by constitutional amendment. You think it's going to be a constitutional amendment during this campaign season? Of course not. For a constitutional amendment, you need, oversized votes, states, everything. It can never happen. We've only amended the Constitution a little over 24 times, and we're not going to do it this time. And he also wants ethics rules. Okay, I'm in favor of ethics rules as well, and I think that you can do those probably without amending the Constitution if you have legislative actions. But then we get to the real point of what they want. They don't care about the structure of the Supreme Court, about term limits. They care about the fact that they lost in the Supreme Court. They lost Roe versus Wade. That's when it really started. Let's pack the court. Let's turn the court more to the left. And then, of course, the most recent decision involving presidential immunity. You can't change that without a constitutional amendment as well. What the justices decided in a decision, which I think may have gone too far on some of the evidentiary issues, but they decided that as a matter of constitutional law, presidents should have immunity along with members of Congress and along with judges. Does anybody want to take away the judicial immunity of judges, the immunity of judges from civil liability? Terrible, terrible decisions, immunizing judges from doing terrible, terrible things that were clearly beyond the scope of their legitimate responsibility. But immunity is part of the constitutional structure. And so they're not happy, the Democrats. I'm not happy with all of these decisions either. I don't think Roe versus Wade should have been overruled. I think the Supreme Court should have simply decided the case that was before it, 15 weeks in Mississippi, uphold that and say, wait until the next case comes up when a state passes a statute saying there's no constitutional right to abortion. We'll decide that case then. They didn't do that. So, just like I was opposed to the judicial reforms proposed in Israel, most of them, because judicial reforms generally, both in Israel and the United States, are proposed not to improve the quality of the Supreme Court in a neutral fashion. They're proposed because one side doesn't like what the other side has done. The Israelis on the right didn't like the fact that the Israeli Supreme Court tended to be left-leaning. And the left in the United States, the tribes, don't like the fact that the Supreme Court today seems to be right-leaning. It was left-leaning before, that was okay, but now that it's right-leaning, let's go back to Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Let's pack the court. Let's impose term limits. Let's do all of these things that will weaken the court, not to structurally help the Supreme Court to make it a better institution, but to make it an institution more compatible with the politics of our side. And, that's what's going on today. The rule of law is being weaponized by both sides, more the Democrats today than the Republicans, using the criminal justice system to go after Donald Trump. My book, Get Trump. I'm not a political supporter of Donald Trump, but I am a legal supporter of the Constitution. And the Constitution cannot be abused by weaponizing the criminal justice system. As I've said before in this show, the worst abuse, akin, maybe even worse than McCarthyism, because McCarthyism basis in the law, although it was dead wrong, completely wrong. When I was a college student, when I was a law school student, I fought against it. But what the New York district attorney did to Donald Trump was worse than anything I've ever seen. Making up a crime out of whole cloth, creating a crime out of nothing. Taking a misdemeanor that was barred by the statute of limitations and turning it into a viable felony. Just wrong. And I think the same thing was true with the January 6th cases. And the Supreme Court has basically said, look, you can't just stretch criminal statutes beyond what they were intended to cover. And we're seeing a lot of litigation on that now. I'm representing one of the young men who was indicted for a felony for simply trespassing in the Capitol when he was waved in by the police. They denied him his ability to take the bar, his graduation from law school, even though he was a good student, because he followed the police. The police said, hey, come in as long as you're basically not destroying any property, not doing anything. And he didn't. He just went there, showed his opposition to the election. He was wrong, in my view, and I've told him that, even though I'm representing him. I think the election was fair, and I think that Joe Biden won the election fair and square. That's not what he thought. That's not what he thinks. It's not what Donald Trump thinks. But that's America. We can have disagreements, and those disagreements can take the form of protests. And when the protests cross the line and become crimes, like they did last week in the District of Columbia, when Prime Minister Netanyahu spoke in Congress, and many senators and congressmen, almost all but one, Democrats, refused to listen in violation of the spirit of the First Amendment, and in Kamala Harris's case, in violation of her constitutional obligation to preside. When that happened, there were protests, but they were just not protests. The statue of, I think it was Christopher Columbus, was defaced. Other statutes were written on. Threats were made. Property crimes occurred. People wrote, I guess you have a constitutional right to say, we're with Hamas. Hamas is coming. We welcome Hamas. We love rapists. We love people who behead babies. You can say all of those things. You just can't write them on statues that are the property of the United States of America. And you can't tear down an American flag from Union Station and burn it. You can burn your own flag, as Justice Brennan once said. If he saw somebody burning a flag, he would do two things. He would defend his right to do so and then punch him in the mouth for being such an un-American, horrible person. I guess that reflects my attitude, too. I'm too old to punch him in the mouth, but I would verbally punch him and defend his right to burn the flag. But you can't burn somebody else's flag. And you can't burn a flag owned by the United States of America. And you can't deface statutes owned by the United States of America. Where are the District of Columbia police? Where is the mayor of the District of Columbia? Why aren't these law violators being punished? Why are only the law violators on the Republican side being subjected to felonies? I'm not making any comparisons between the cases, but if you say nobody's above the law, that means these people who are writing Hamas is coming on statues are not above the law. they should be prosecuted, and they're not being prosecuted. So, we have a real problem with the law. Look, I'm a legal realist. I went to Yale Law School. I studied the work of Jerome Frank. I think of myself as a very pragmatic realist in the spirit of Oliver Wendell Holmes and others. I don't believe the law is sacred, that the law comes from, some mountaintop and that it's neutral. As you know, the reason that judges in England wear wigs and funny, uniforms is that they should all look the same because the law is supposed to be impersonal. I don't believe any of that, but the law is supposed to be nonpartisan. At the very least, it's not supposed to depend on who is in power. It was Alexander Hamilton in the Federalist Papers who said the most dangerous, not the second most dangerous, the most dangerous thing would be for impeachment to be turned into a political weapon, whereby the outcome of an impeachment trial would turn on who had the most votes. That's exactly what has happened. Yes, the Democratic House impeaches. Yes, the Republican Senate doesn't convict. That's what's going on, and both sides have been misusing impeachment. The Republicans went after Mayorkas. You may not like what he's done on the border, but he didn't commit an impeachable crime. And I am convinced if Donald Trump were to be elected, it would be just a few months before the Democrats, if they control the House, would come up with resolutions of impeachment. I'm sure Professor Tribe would draft them and would say that they're perfectly constitutional, as he did about the two unconstitutional impeachment provisions that were voted on by the Democratic Congress. So whether you're a Democrat or Republican, whether you're a Harvard Law School professor or a citizen who just cares about our Constitution, it doesn't matter. The Constitution is what makes us an independent country under the rule of law. One of the books I'm most proud of is a tiny little book, just a tiny little book. I don't know, is it 100 pages even? No, it's less than that, that I wrote about the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence and my little introduction. I carry this around with me, although I pretty much know the Constitution by heart at this point. And sometimes, you have to look things up. And the Constitution is really important, and the rule of law is really important, and we're losing it. We're losing it primarily these days to the Democrats. It's ironic because the Democrats are saying, oh my God, if you vote for Trump, he will turn us away from democracy and against the rule of law. And Trump has made some really outrageous statements, telling Christians the other day, all you have to do is vote once for me. If you vote for me once, I'll solve all the problems. Then you're never going to vote again. You don't have to vote again. That just doesn't sound like America. We want Christians to vote in every election, just the way we want Muslims and Jews to vote in every election. But the fact is that although it's the Democrats who think the Republicans will take democracy away from us, and maybe they will, and you have a right to vote if you believe that against them, but so far it's been the Democrats who have been denying us our constitutional rights. It's the Democrats who have been weaponizing the criminal justice system against Donald Trump, the impeachment system against Donald Trump. So, who's calling the kettle? I think both parties are at fault here. And I worry deeply about the enduring rule of law in the United States and our enduring Constitution. It's under threat from both sides. All right, let's turn to some letters. Professor, during the speech of Prime Minister Netanyahu, hundreds of pro-Hamas protesters went to Union Station, lowered the American flag, burnt it, raised the Palestinian flag. They defaced numerous monuments. The Democratic mayor did nothing to stop it. Harris has publicly said she admires the spirit of those protesters. How can you vote for her? Well, let's see what the Democrats do. The statement about Harris is out of context. It didn't refer to these protesters. I'm worried that the Democrats have applied a double standard, that the Black Lives Matter people and these folks in Washington have received far, far, far more sympathetic treatment. And we know that Harris did raise money for bail for the Black Lives Matter protesters. I have no problem with that. Everybody should get bail if they're subject to bail. and they shouldn't be denied bail because of money. But if you selectively only raise bail money for one group of protesters and not others, you're not being neutral. All right. The Prime Minister of Israel gave one of the most wonderful speeches I have heard in years. There was passion and love for his home country in abundance. Israel has always had memorable prime ministers, and Mr. Netanyahu was certainly among them. Simply wonderful. Okay, that's one point of view. Now, let me read you another point of view. Nancy Pelosi. She said the Prime Minister Netanyahu's speech was, quote, the worst speech ever delivered by a foreign leader. Either she is a liar or an ignoramus. There's no third alternative. Or a bigot. Netanyahu's speech, you may not agree with everything. You may not think it was the best speech ever made. But to call it the worst speech ever delivered by a foreign leader does not pass the perjury test. It's an opinion, so she can't be indicted for perjury. But she's making it up. It's just not true. It was not the worst speech. It was one of the best speeches. I was there for his first speech, which was memorable. It was Churchill-like. I was sitting in the front row with Mrs. Netanyahu and Elie Wiesel and Mrs. Wiesel. I was invited to do the same thing for this speech. I wish I could have done it, but as you know, my unkosher hamstring was torn. Getting better. It's getting a little better now. And I couldn't go. I watched every minute of it. I watched it in spirit. I wish I could have been there. And I got a nice letter about that. Let's see if I can